Hi there, we're back with another lesson on Malcolm X's Learning to Read. Our first few lessons we dealt mostly with the creation of an argument. So this is the rhetorical framework we've been working with. So we started with exigence, which is that spark, that thing that makes an author feel like they need to share an idea. Then who they're going to address, their audience, their actual purpose, what they want to convey. Then their logos, which is that central claim, usually backed with some sort of logic and reasoning. We talked about how you might appeal to emotion or character. So appealing to emotion and ethos, or appealing to emotion, appealing to emotion with pathos, or appealing to character with ethos. I always get them mixed up when I first say them too. Often students get them mixed up because obviously ethos sounds like emotion because they start with the same letter. A way to remember this is that pathos comes from the same root word as the word pathetic. So if you think about it, it's kind of sad to think about it like that, but being pathetic is showing too much of negative emotion. So pathetic is pathos. So that's the connection there. But today what we're going to talk about is structure and organization. So how do the structure and organization of a text inform the message? So why do authors put things in a certain order? Why do they start with something and then maybe build to their stronger idea? How does the way that things are put in place in a text actually inform its message? So if you look here, that's sort of the last sort of decision you make as you're building an argument. But it is a really important one. For a lot of authors, this is where you have to get first before you can even start writing. You have to think, is this something that I should make a movie about? Should I write a poem? Should this be a speech or a letter, a book, an essay? Should this just be a conversation with my friends that I have? You know, what is the form that my message needs to take? So that's what we're looking at today. Because I've been reading the text aloud the last few times, what I'm actually going to do is just show sections and then pause and allow you to read on your own. You might want to read out loud. You might want to read in your head. Totally up to you. But just to practice kind of getting your own reading sense here. I will give you a warning that the rest of this text does talk about maybe some tricky topics or maybe some things you're not used to talking about. So please keep that in mind as we're reading, that what we're doing is rhetorical analysis. So that means that we're analyzing how an author makes an argument, and you don't actually need to agree or disagree with the author. All you need to be able to do is understand their argument. So while you might not like some of the things he says, or maybe you do, the point here is really, can you understand Malcolm X's message, not your personal opinion of it? So last time we left off with him talking about how he was learning to read in the library and borrowing books, reading during times when he wasn't supposed to be reading, but reading nonetheless. And now we're going to pick up from there. So here is the next section. I'm going to go ahead, just move myself down here. I'm going to pause for a few minutes to let you read this section. Just give me about 30 more seconds. There's some really powerful images in this section, right? So far, we've mostly been getting the adult Malcolm X reflecting on what's going on in his life. But here we get an anecdote. So don't forget, anecdote is what you call using stories. Oops, anecdote. An anecdote is what you get when you're using stories as evidence. So here we have this anecdote about how he was learning history in the 7th grade. So Malcolm X is now making sort of a sub-claim. So a sub-claim is something that supports his larger claim. And here he's talking about how history had been whitened. He uses the phrase whitened in quotation marks because this is a specific term that Malcolm X is originating in this text. So he is going to give his own definition of this word, this term, which he does after the dash. So what he means by whitened is, he tells us, when white men have written history books, Black man has been left out. So that's what he's referring to when he says history has been whitened. This is really important because oftentimes when authors are creating their own argument, they're going to use their own key terms. This is what's called an argument of definition. So what he's doing here is making a claim based on what he is defining as history. So some people might disagree with him specifically on the basis of how he's defining history, or they might agree with him. So this is a definition-based argument here, or subclaim. So he's giving us this anecdote about how 7th grade, the only history that he ever got that was specifically talking about the Black American experience was one paragraph. Wow, that should be a pretty striking image for us. Imagine sitting in a classroom and the only thing that you get that sounds anything that you can connect to is one paragraph in the entire history book. This might be literally true, or it might be an exaggeration. Either way, it doesn't matter because the anecdote here is powerful. And then you get this even more shocking and harmful addition to the anecdote, where he says that the teacher got a laugh at a really racist and insensitive joke. So imagine you're getting your history taught. It's only one paragraph, and even that is made into a joke. So you can understand why maybe Malcolm X is saying a lot of people don't know their education or don't know their history, or maybe aren't interested in it, is because they've been convinced for so long that there isn't any, which is what he talks about in that second paragraph. So he's giving us specific personal evidence as reasoning for why Mr. Muhammad's teachings have spread. Because this is the one time when you're finally getting what he calls, in his own words here, the glorious history of the Black man. Basically, it's been his whole life before he's finally saying, wait, there's more than this one paragraph. Okay? So remember my question that I asked earlier to think about is, how are they structuring the argument? So remember, Malcolm X starts with saying, okay, I decide to read books once I've gotten to jail. I'm reading all the time. Now he's sort of backtracking. So he could have started with this, but he's choosing not to. He's choosing not to start with such a shocking anecdote. He's rather talking about his own personal story of learning to read and learning to be educated in jail. Why? I might think that perhaps it's a little bit more interesting to start with his own personal experience. Especially if you know you're reading his autobiography, you might be more concerned with his personal life, rather than what he's saying here is a more sweeping generalization about what life is like for Black Americans. So he's introducing his own personal reality first, before jumping backwards and explaining why it's of importance to him. Let's see what he's going to do next. Let me go ahead and clear my drawings here. Okay, here's our next section. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and pause for a second and let you read this on your own. About 30 more seconds. Okay, so now when we're talking about structure, he's doing another really interesting move here. So originally, he was talking more broadly about books that he had read. Now he's being specific. This is a great way for him to bring in what are called allusions. Oops, let me do it in all caps. Allusions. Allusions are references to other works of literature, media, things like that. Usually, allusions are not so specific. Usually, you're just going to make an allusion to some other work, and your audience should just pick up on it and go, I know that. But here he's being even more direct. He's giving us specific titles of works, which is really important because they're giving his whole essay here, his book, this excerpt, more credibility. He's referencing where he's getting his information. So essentially what he's doing is citing his sources. Another really interesting thing that he's doing here structurally is he's telling us a little bit about the future. He's saying, here's what's going on after I've gotten out of prison, after I've been educated, after I've become well known. He tells us that he has children and that he's educating his children in the same way he was educated. This is a really smart structural move because even if you weren't on board yet, maybe you weren't solely convinced, he's telling you what he lacked as a child, how he got it back, and then how he's giving that education to his kids. Wow, what an expert move when you're writing an argument. The past, the present, and then the future. Great for a structure. What he's actually doing here, though, is telling you about the books that are showing his own self-education. Books that depict non-European people, about Black empires that existed before Black people were in the United States. So this is going to be really important for his self-education because remember, he had just told us the only thing he got in school was one paragraph. And now he's discovering books and books and books of this. Let's go ahead and read the next section. Let me just shrink my screen again. Same thing. I'm going to go ahead and just give you a few minutes to read this on your own. About 30 more seconds. Okay, this is some awesome work he's doing here rhetorically. That first paragraph, reference after reference after reference after reference. Amazingly, even if you don't know each specific one, by using this repetition, he's really driving the point home of all these extra things of history he's learning. Maybe you don't know what all of them are, but the odds are you know what at least one of them is. So he's drawing you in here. Let's talk about the first paragraph before I move on to the second one, because the second one is beautifully constructed as well. So here he's giving us another specific reference to a book, and he's talking about different specific instances. So one is he talks about the idea of what's called race mixing. So this is intermixing between different races. Of course, race is more of a social construct in that it doesn't really exist. Humans sort of came up with names for different races, but really the only thing we know exists for sure is differences in skin tone. So differences in skin tone contribute to why people are different colors based on the amount of melanin they have in their skin. Later on, as humans decided to separate into different societies, as we naturally evolved, then races came about as a way to label those differences in skin color. So what he's talking about here is the way that races were intermixing in prehistoric times. So he's talking about the time of Christ. Of course, in our modern calendar, we start our calendar, the year now being 2020. So it starts at year 0 AD. Usually that's the Latin reference, but that usually is counted as the time of Christ's death. Obviously, not all cultures are going to follow this timeline because not all cultures are Christian. And of course, there was lots of history that existed before Christ, here referring to Jesus, was ever born. Most of human history is before that time, but we don't have a lot of it tracked because history wasn't always being written down. So the time of basing our modern time off of Jesus's life and death sort of gets a little bit confusing because then our calendar is only based on the life of one person, and human history isn't just constrained to that. That being said, we know that there must be different races because races existed before then, or there it is, different skin tones. He then also gives us a reference to Aesop, who you might know from Aesop's fables. Then he also talks about the pharaohs of Egypt. Here you have to be a little bit careful because some of the later pharaohs actually were not Black because they had sort of imposed themselves on that domain. However, a lot of time that was being ruled in Africa, and some people forget Egypt's in Africa, is of course going to be ruled by people who are Black because of where it is located geographically. But you might not know that if you've been simply thinking about the portrayals of Egypt in Western cinema and media. He talks about the great Coptic Christian Empire. So Coptic Christians are obviously Christians who exist as almost their own ethnicity in parts of Northern Africa. Often we think of parts of Africa being, and Northern Africa being Islamic, and that's not 100% true. There are large majorities of people there who are Christian. He talks about Ethiopia, which has the world's oldest continuous Black civilization, in Malcolm X's words. And then he makes reference to it compared to China being the other oldest civilization. Sometimes we get a little bit distracted and think that Western civilization is the oldest, and that's not true. History books have misled us that way. So he's doing a really great thing here with this listing. Paragraph 2 is a really great way to introduce a very complicated scientific principle in an easy to understand way. So this is a great thing he's doing structurally about this excerpt and about his autobiography in general. When he's explaining how he learned to read and how he self-educated himself, he learned in this way. He tells us first in a flashback sort of here to when he was reading the dictionary earlier, he discovered what the word genetics meant. Then, of course, he reads one of the earliest texts about genetics by Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk. Who would have thought that an imprisoned African American is going to be reading the original text by Austrian monks? That's what he wants us to think as an audience. Of course, knowing what we know about the expansive library that was at this prison, it might make sense that there are these sort of lofty texts there. But how many of us have actually read Gregor Mendel's original text? Malcolm X here is breaking down that whole work in something super simple. You might have already known this as something called the Punnett square. Excuse my drawing here. So this is where you get the origins of genetics, right? So you get recessive genes and dominant genes. And so he's explaining here that even if all you know is a rudimentary understanding of genetics, you know that because the white gene, or rather light pigment of the skin, is recessive, you can only ever get white people by having recessive genes, but it can never be the reverse. So this only exists if you have two recessive genes being white, but because most people have both recessive and dominant genes, this would mean that if you look at my example Punnett square here, this would mean that if all you had were all dominant genes or dominant and a recessive, you can never reach just only Black people being produced if the origin was white. Basically, boiling down a really expansive genetic concept into something so simple and clear for any audience to understand. Really interesting structurally, because we know he was reading, we know he's being educated. Now he's telling us specifics about what he's being educated on. So that's how he's developing the structure of this text. So that's where we're gonna go ahead and stop for today. I'm gonna leave you with this last little section that I want you to read on your own and just kind of ponder and think about it. What is he doing with structure and organization here? And then we're gonna pick up next time. So I'm gonna just give a couple seconds, and you can pause if you need to read this next section before we continue next time.